Welcome back to Catalyst University. My name is Kevin Tokoph, and in this video, this long-awaited video, we're going to be doing part 3 of the gait cycle. In the previous video, we finished with pre-swing. So in this video, we're going to be looking at the swing phase. Initial swing, mid-swing, and terminal swing. And I apologize for this taking so long to be made. I've had a lot of things going on, started a new job as a physical therapist, etc., etc. There's just been a lot going on, and honestly, I've been procrastinating on it. So I finally got around to getting this done. Let's get into it. So with swing phase, we are in a period of single limb support. Pre-swing, before this, was a period of double limb support. And remember, there are 3 periods of double limb support. Pre-swing is one, and then initial contact and the loading response. This is single limb support with respect to the contralateral limb. With respect to the reference limb, it's in swing phase, and it won't be double limb support again until we get that heel strike after terminal swing, which would be initial contact of the next gait cycle. Okay? So, without further ado, let's get into it right now. The first part of swing phase we're going to talk about is initial swing. Now, before we get into that, let's take a look at this picture up here. You see what was pre-swing that we talked about in the previous video. You can see the ankles plantar flexed, the heels off the ground, but the toes, they're still in contact with the ground, MTP joints in about 60 degrees of extension, right? And the thing that marks pre-swing as different from initial swing is that in pre-swing, the foot is still in contact with the ground. In fact, the defined cutoff when pre-swing ends and initial swing begins is literally just when the foot leaves the floor. Because pre-swing, like initial contact and loading response, this is one of the 3 periods when we're in double limb support. Foot's still on the ground. But as soon as that foot leaves, as soon as that matter microscopically leaves the floor, we start initial swing, basically. Okay? That's because initial swing is swing. By definition, that reference limb needs to be off the ground. And then with respect to the contralateral limb here in white, we're in single limb support again. Okay? So let's take a look at initial swing right here in the video. So you can see here, if you look closely, those toes, they've just barely left the floor. Okay? They're no longer in contact, which means we're not in pre-swing. We have just started initial swing. And obviously this leg is going to start swinging forward, right? And right about here, this would be basically the end of initial swing. So what's happening in initial swing? What are the key events? Well, we've got 2 things. Number 1, we've got maximum knee flexion. So the angle of knee flexion is the highest in initial swing. That's very important to understand, especially when we start getting into gait abnormalities, which we'll be covering later. And also in just a few minutes, I'm going to mention a couple key ones. And then also we have a hip flexion to 15 degrees. Why is that important? Well, in terminal stance and pre-swing, the hip is actually in a position of extension, and really sort of around the beginning, the middle of pre-swing. Not really visible here in this picture, but you're in about 10 degrees of hip extension. So to get to 15 degrees of hip flexion, that is a 25-degree increase in the hip flexion angle from 10 degrees of extension to 15 degrees of hip flexion. So those hip flexors, as you'll see in just a few minutes, they've got to be pretty darn active. So what is the cutoff between initial swing and mid-swing? Well, the end of initial swing is really a few things. Number 1, it's when the foot here begins to start to cross past the other foot, that is the contralateral foot. When that happens, we're starting to blend into mid-swing. But the other thing you'll see in a minute is that in initial swing, the ankle joint is technically still in a little bit of plantar flexion. You'll notice, jumping ahead, that in mid-swing, the angle of the talocrural joint is neutral, 0 degrees. Once we hit 0 degrees at that ankle joint, we have technically crossed into mid-swing. So these 2 phases sort of blend together, but especially once we get to ankle neutral at the talocrural joint, that's when we have definitively crossed into mid-swing. Okay? Let's take a look at initial swing in more detail now. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look and see what happens at each of the various joints here, the hip, the knee, the ankle, etc., during each of these swing phases, initial swing, mid-swing, and terminal swing.
So what's happening at the hip during initial swing? Well, we have a decreasing extension torque that eventually goes to neutral. Now, overall, throughout swing, we're transitioning from an extension torque, eventually to neutral, and then into a flexion torque, which makes sense, right? If we go back to terminal stance and pre-swing, the femur of the reference limb, the one that we're talking about, is behind the frontal plane of the body, right? We're in about 10 degrees of hip extension during pre-swing. And if we're going to swing the leg forward to advance, we're going to have to move from a position of hip extension into hip flexion. And so what we're seeing from pre-swing into initial swing and then especially into mid-swing, we're getting an increase in that hip flexion angle. And so from pre-swing to initial swing, we're having to get a lot more flexion. In fact, we're going from 10 degrees of hip extension and we're actually going 25 degrees towards a flexed position to 15 degrees of hip flexion. And in order to get to that point, we're actually going to use the hip flexors. And if you look at all of these muscles right here, iliacus, gracilis, sartorius, adductor longus, they may have other functions, like the gracilis is an adductor, sartorius performs the Faber motion, adductor longus is an adductor, but all of these have a secondary action as a hip flexor, okay? And iliacus, of course, is one of the primary hip flexors. So we're going to use all these hip flexors to go from 10 degrees of hip extension to 15 degrees of hip flexion. Then at the knee joint, just like in pre-swing, we have a flexion torque at the knee. Now, what muscles are active here? We have the biceps femoris, which is one of the hamstrings, so it is a knee flexor. We have the sartorius and the gracilis, and both of these muscles have secondary actions as knee flexors, okay? Now, a large amount of the knee flexion that we get during this swing is passive. And that's due to the plantar flexion that we get during pre-swing and also due to some of the hip flexion that we're getting as we're going towards initial and mid-swing. But some of the knee flexion is also active. And that's provided by these muscles right here. And what's important to know about initial swing is this is where the degree of knee flexion is the greatest. Okay, 60 degrees of knee flexion compared to 40 during pre-swing and 25 during mid-swing. So this is maximum knee flexion here. If for whatever reason you had a person who was deficient in knee flexion, and a great example would be someone with a total knee replacement who really hasn't advanced very far with this, they're going to have a lot of difficulty clearing that foot over the ground because they're deficient in that knee flexion. And of course, most people when they come out of a total knee are going to have a little bit more than that, but in some cases they'll have less. And so what you might see are some compensatory patterns like some circumduction at the hip or maybe some vaulting in order to clear that foot over the ground. So you need at least 60 degrees of knee flexion in order to have proper mechanics of getting that foot to clear the ground. And speaking of getting the foot to clear the ground, we have what's going on here at the ankle joint. So one of the big goals of this entire swing phase is getting the foot to clear the floor. Interestingly, the foot does not clear the floor by very far. It's only a gap of about 1 centimeter. And if that is off by anything greater than 1 centimeter, the foot or the toes, something's going to happen. It's going to hit the floor and it's going to drag and create a risk of fall and injury from that fall. So it's very important to have proper muscle activation in order to clear the foot and have it not crash or drag into the floor. And if it doesn't do that, we end up with situations like foot drop, which is where there's some issue with the tibialis anterior. Normally it's nerve damage of some kind to the deep fibular nerve or something higher up. But again, we'll be covering that in later videos. So at the ankle joint during initial swing, we have what was a decreasing dorsiflexion torque in pre-swing going into a low plantar flexion torque in initial swing. And as you might imagine, to clear that foot across the ground, we have activation of the pretibials. This is going to facilitate dorsiflexion and to help clear that foot so that the toes don't drag across the floor, the foot doesn't drag across the floor, etc. Okay? And notice in pre-swing we had 15 degrees of plantar flexion. Well, during initial swing, we're not quite getting to neutral yet, but you see we're moving in that direction. So we drop about 10 degrees and we get to about 5 degrees of plantar flexion here. Okay? Now, at the subtalar joint, during pre-swing, we had a decreasing inversion torque, and now throughout the remainder of swing, it's a negligible inversion torque, okay? Part of that inversion torque is just the fact that inversion is the natural resting position of the subtalar joint. So as the ankle is free floating, you're getting a little bit of a natural inversion torque because that's closer to the resting position, okay? And really throughout the entire swing phase, we have the tibialis anterior that is working at the subtalar joint, because recall, not only is the tibialis anterior a dorsiflexor, but it also has a secondary action at inversion of the subtalar joint. And then at the MTP joints here, we have a flexion torque that is rapidly decreasing to 0 by the end of initial swing. And then we really don't even have to worry about those torques throughout the remainder of the gait cycle. Now, at the end of pre-swing, notice we had about 60 degrees of MTP extension, and that is passive extension, okay? When you're in pre-swing, yes, there's activation of the triceps suri, which eventually stops at the end of this phase, but that puts the MTP joints in 60 degrees of extension. So when the foot finally leaves the ground in swing phase, those toes are moving back from extension towards their resting position, which is more or less neutral. So that's why we have the flexion torque here. And in order to control that so it doesn't pop down into actual flexion, that is the MTP joints, we have these two muscles which control that movement, okay? And again, throughout this initial swing, the overall range of motion of the MTP joints really should just be neutral, should be 0, should be neither extended nor flexed. Okay, but these muscles are controlling that flexion torque that's present because we're rapidly losing that MTP extension as the foot leaves the ground. And then at the pelvis, the reference limb side is in 5 degrees of posterior or backward rotation. And that makes sense because if you look back at this slide right here, you can see that the contralateral limb is still in front of the reference limb. And so for that to be the case, the side of the reference limb would have to be in backward rotation, okay?
So now we have mid-swing. So in mid-swing, right down here, you see that the reference foot is really starting to cross over the contralateral foot. Let's take a look at mid-swing in its entirety, okay? Take a look at that again. Picking up at the end of initial swing, to this point. Now, what is this point? Well, I've stopped it here just milliseconds before we start terminal swing. So the end of mid-swing is really when the tibia here reaches vertical. So once the lateral malleolus here is in line with the lateral epicondyle, and we're not quite there, we're almost there, maybe one more degree, maybe half a degree, that would be the demarcation between mid-swing and terminal swing. So if we go any further, that lateral malleolus will cross in front of the lateral epicondyle, and then we'd be in terminal swing. Now, what are the critical events of mid-swing? Well, first of all, as we mentioned before, we're going to go from what was a little bit of plantar flexion in initial swing, and we're going to continue dorsiflexing, to neutral. At no point does the ankle joint actually go into net dorsiflexion. It just gets to neutral, okay? And the whole point of getting to neutral is so that foot doesn't slap the floor, drag the floor as you're clearing the foot, okay? It only crosses or clears the floor by 1 centimeter. That's amazing. Just 1 centimeter. And so if you can't get that ankle to neutral and it's remaining in plantar flexion, it's just going to drag across the floor and you're going to end up with problems. And there's many gait abnormalities that involve just that, okay? So dorsiflexion to neutral. The other thing here in mid-swing is that we get a maximum hip flexion angle of 25 degrees. So the hip flexion angle peaks here. Let's take a look at mid-swing now in a little bit more detail.
Now, for mid-swing at the hip, we are transitioning from what was a decreasing extension torque to neutral to now an increasing flexion torque at the hip. Remember, with the hip, the thigh is advancing forward using the actions of the hip flexors. But you'll notice here that the hip flexors are no longer active. That's because we already have sufficient momentum that has been gathered by these hip flexors in initial swing, and now we just need to control that hip flexion so it isn't excessively driving that limb forward. Okay, so to control it, we have the hamstrings. Hamstrings act as hip extensors here, and they're acting to control this increasing flexion torque. What you should also notice here is that we now peak at the angle of hip flexion. So mid-swing is where we have the greatest angle of hip flexion, and that is 25 degrees. Okay. Now at the knee joint, there is a flexion torque which moves into an extension torque by the end of mid-swing and carries over into terminal swing. So as the hip swings forward, the tendency is the knee is going to extend, more or less passively. Okay, we don't need the quads to do that here. As the thigh is driving forward, the knee is going to tend to extend, thus this extension torque. And so to control that rapidly decreasing flexion torque and increasing extension torque, we have the biceps femoris, okay, one of the hamstring muscles. Again, the hamstrings also act as a knee flexor, so that can help control this knee extension, okay? Also notice from initial swing where we had the peak knee flexion, 60 degrees, it decreases quite substantially to about 25 degrees of knee flexion, okay? Now, what is the exact cutoff between initial swing and mid-swing? Well, you might hear different definitions depending on your text, depending on your teacher, but realistically, it is the cutoff where the ankle is no longer in plantar flexion, it has achieved neutral. When the ankle gets to neutral, we have officially gone from initial swing to mid-swing, assuming that the person has normal gait mechanics, okay? So we still have a plantar flexion torque, but it is negligible at the ankle joint. And at this point, the pre-tibials are contracting concentrically because we're having to move from this 5 degrees of plantar flexion to neutral. And again, why are we contracting the pre-tibials? It makes sense. We don't want that foot to crash into the floor or to drag. That's going to create a fall risk, and if there's a fall, there could be an injury, okay? These have got to contract concentrically. Again, somebody with weak anterior tibs or a damage to the deep fibular nerve, that's going to create a significant problem, especially in this mid-swing, but also throughout the entire swing phase, okay? At the subtalar joint, again, we have a negligible inversion torque, and we still have activation of, again, one of those pretibials, tibialis anterior, which is functioning as a mild inverter of the subtalar joint. And again, subtalar joint is still at 0. What you're also going to see during mid-swing is that at some point, the thigh of the reference limb is going to cross over the thigh of the contralateral limb. And so what that means for the pelvis is that the pelvis will have a point where it's at neutral rotation. The only other time we see this during the gait cycle is during mid-stance. So the mid-stance, mid-swing, that's where we're going to see that neutral rotation, okay?
Now finally, terminal swing. We are almost done. Terminal swing, you could almost think of as really just the continuation of swing phase and a preparation for initial contact of the next cycle, preparation for that heel strike. When we go and look at that table in just a few minutes of the various muscles that are active, most of these things are just preparation for that heel strike that's coming next. Now we said that the demarcation between mid-swing and terminal swing is when that lateral malleolus crosses the lateral epicondyle. Basically, the ankle goes in front of the knee. And so that's what we're going to see here, okay? And it continues just right before that heel strikes the ground. So that heel is almost, it's like millimeters from striking the ground. That would be heel strike, and that would be initial contact of the next cycle. So terminal swing, it goes from where the tibia is vertical just to almost where that heel is touching the ground, but not quite. Remember, because terminal swing is still part of single limb support with respect to the contralateral limb. And then the critical event of terminal swing is knee extension to neutral. And I should clarify this. A lot of sources will say knee extension to neutral. You're not actually going to neutral where the knee is totally straight. In fact, we'll see in a minute on the table it's about 5 degrees of knee flexion. And that's the straightest the knee ever gets during the gait cycle. 5 degrees of knee flexion. This is really going to be a problem only for patients that lack full knee extension, where they have a severe deficit. And I got 2 great examples. One would be a total knee replacement. Oftentimes after a total knee, when somebody really is able to walk normally, there's not really any restrictions. If they have a severe deficit, I had one patient recently who came out of surgery. 5 days later, they were about 10 degrees short. Well, they're 5 degrees short of the necessity for terminal swing. So this terminal swing is going to look very different. They're not going to be able to get to that 5 degrees. There's going to be some compensations that are needed. Okay. Another example, I had a patient who had a meniscectomy, and she went through rehab at a different place, and for whatever reason, they kind of botched it. And at the end of it, she was 10 degrees short of full extension at the knee. That's going to alter the mechanics of terminal swing. So for most patients, this is not going to be a problem unless there's a pretty significant contracture or just some kind of deficit of knee extension. Okay.
Now, in terminal swing for both the hip and the knee, it's useful to think about what comes next to understand why certain muscles contract. What's coming after terminal swing? Well, technically the gait cycle is complete, but we're going to start another cycle, and that's going to be initial contact, where the heel is going to strike the ground. Okay, so we're preparing for that during terminal swing. Okay, so at the hip joint, we have now a decreasing flexion torque. And you'll notice the muscles that are activating, adductor magnus, gluteus maximus and medius, and the tensor fascia lata, these muscles right here are actually acting to prepare for stabilization in the frontal plane. When you strike at initial contact, you better have frontal plane stabilization there. So both adductors and abductors need to be active to have that frontal plane stability. So they're preparing for that. And then what we also see at the hip is the hamstrings peak in activity. Okay. Now at the knee joint, we have an extension torque. Okay. That extension torque continues from mid-swing. Now at this point, the quads do contract concentrically. And part of the reason they do this is because when we get to that heel strike during initial contact, we don't want the knees to buckle. Okay, we don't want the knees to buckle. So the quadriceps are contracted concentrically to drive that knee extension, but also to prepare for the incoming initial contact. And also, again, hamstrings are peaked in activity here, again, to control the activity of the quadriceps, to kind of counter that eccentrically, so to speak. Okay. And you'll notice here that we have a rapidly decreasing knee flexion angle. We go from 25 degrees in mid-swing down to 5 degrees in terminal swing. And this is the lowest amount of knee flexion that we have during any phase of gait. There is never a time in gait when there's 0 at the knee. It's always at a minimum 5 degrees of knee flexion. Okay? Ankle joint, everything here pretty much makes sense. Again, we have negligible plantar flexion, but eventually that torque is going towards neutral as we get closer and closer to heel strike. And the pretibials now, they're not contracting concentrically, they're contracting isometrically. And we're just maintaining that neutral position of the ankle to prepare for that heel strike that's going to occur in the next phase. At the subtalar joint, still have that negligible inversion torque and activity of the tibialis anterior. And then what you'll also see here is at the pelvis, we're going to have 5 degrees of forward rotation, which makes sense because during terminal swing, the reference limb has advanced in front of the frontal plane of the body. So that side is going to be 5 degrees forwardly rotated.
Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. I apologize for taking so long for getting it made, getting it up on YouTube, but hopefully you learned a lot about the swing phase of the gait cycle. And be sure to check out my previous 2 videos, parts 1 and 2, where we start at initial contact and go all the way through pre-swing. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel and hit that notification button for notifications for all videos in the future. Thank you so much.